Hello and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I'm Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of the Election Law Program. And in today's episode, we're delighted to welcome Nick Stephanopoulos, who is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. And Nick is with us today because in just a few days, the Ohio State Law Journal will be hosting its annual symposium. And this year, the symposium will be featuring Nick's new book, Aligning Election Law, as the focus of a conversation about the way in which election law today in the United States arguably is misaligned in a number of significant dimensions. In the run-up to our symposium event, the Law and Democracy podcast has had a couple of opportunities to preview what will be going on at the symposium. And so, Nick, we really welcome you to this podcast today and are especially excited to see you again at the symposium in a few days. Before we begin the conversation, let me also just say how good it is to be back with other members of our election law team. We have Ned Foley with us today, the Director of Election Law, and then Terry Enns and Tony Goggin, Senior Fellows of the Election Law Program here at The Ohio State University. So with that, Tony, I'll give you the first crack at asking Nick about his project.
Well, I should point out that I actually have a copy of Nick's book right here. And Nick, I will be asking you to sign my copy later this week when I see you at the symposium. But maybe it'd be best for our audience if, Nick, you could begin by just providing a basic overview of the thesis of your book.
Yeah, great. And thanks so much for having me on here and for helping to put together the symposium. I'm delighted both about the symposium and for having the chance now to chat with you about the book. So the thesis of the book is pretty simple. It's that what I call alignment should be one of the overarching principles of election law, both with regard to litigation and also how we think about structuring our electoral regulations. And what I mean by alignment is congruence or fit between what the government does and what people want the government to do. It's a fairly intuitive democratic value, but a lot of the ways in which particular electoral practices are either aligning or misaligning hasn't really been fully developed before this book. And so the motivation of the book is to develop at length what an alignment-oriented theory of election law would look like, what's the theoretical basis for this theory, the legal basis, and what are some of the practical applications of the theory across different domains within election law.
You know, just to hear you characterize it that simply and crystallize it that way, Nick, makes me think of how many ways that alignment frame has at least been lurking in the background for a long time. And yet, what I think what you're trying to do as a new contribution here is to say, let's bring it out of the background. Let's just stop thinking about the problem of misalignment as just something we complain about, and let's think about it as something that we try to, in fact, focus on or even measure. And so that leads me to this question of whether you think there are ways to try to measure it itself.
Yeah, I think part of why this idea was often in the background in the past was an inability to crisply measure the phenomenon, right? There might be a perception of misalignment at different points in the past, but it was hard to put one's finger on what the extent of misalignment was. So, here political scientists have made some real advances over the last 10, 20 years in measuring this thing. So the classic work here by people like Martin Gillant at the federal level, Chris Warshaw and Devin Coey at the state level, relies on a combination of public opinion surveys and data about the output of government. So, surveys are the best tool we have to assess what people's views are, what policies they approve or disapprove of. We then want to bring together the survey data about people's opinions with data on the policies government is adopting or the stances that legislators are taking, and look at how close or how distant are those outputs from people's preferences. And so Martin Gillant did this in a famous book at the federal level and found that only about half of the time do the views of a majority of Americans translate into federal policy that is congruent with that majority. Coey and Warshaw did an even more ambitious project, measuring alignment over 80, 90 years of state level policy. They basically used all surveys since the dawn of opinion polling in the 1930s. And they also measured state policies over the better part of the century. And their conclusion is slightly more optimistic. Maybe majoritarian alignment occurs at the state level something like 60% of the time. But so a lot of what we now know about alignment is only possible thanks to these methodological advances over the last decade or so.
Nick, I'm curious as to what reception you've had to the book outside the community of election law scholars. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the book, of the alignment theory, since you developed it, in the Columbia Law Review article. I teach it to my election law students as potentially the unifying theory of all aspects of election law, from campaign finance to redistricting to everything else. But reflecting on the relationship of election law to the broader topic of democratic theory or political philosophy, I've been surprised to some degree about how untheoretical the field of election law has been compared to, say, constitutional law, which is dependent upon political philosophy for decades. Maybe it's because election law is sort of a younger field. There had been some, theoretical attempts before alignment, but I'm curious as to whether or not you've shopped the alignment theory outside the law school community to political theorists and have gotten any reaction to it from those quarters.
Yeah, great. I agree within election law, there's a shortage of theory-based extended perspectives on the field. So, like Rick Hasson had a book 20 years ago developing his theory of election law, but there's been a surprising lack of book-length developments of election law theories compared to many other legal areas, right? In constitutional law, in administrative law, in property law, in law and economics, one can easily think of major books presenting theories, and I've been surprised at how few of those efforts there have been in election law. So I've had some conversations about alignment with political theorists. Their response has tended to be positive, but thinking that the real contribution of the book is not the theoretical one, but rather the mix of theory, doctrine, and empirical applications. So, under the names of either congruence or correspondence, political theorists have often talked about something like alignment. And so folks like Jane Mansbridge and Andrew Reffield and others have written that something like alignment is at the core of numerous different theories of representation or democracy. There's a little bit of pushback that I've gotten. So Andrew Sable at Toronto is somebody that I've had some conversations with. He's a very good political theorist. He's written some papers criticizing alignment as or something like alignment as an overarching goal. And so I tried in the book to explain why a more refined version of alignment isn't subject to some of Sable's critiques. And he read that chapter of the book and thinks it does sort of a fine job of refuting some of these criticisms, but he's maybe not fully on board with the project. So I think in the political theory world, they're certainly familiar with something like alignment as a democratic value. And there's some division within that theory community as to whether alignment is the paramount democratic goal, or whether it's less important than something like deliberation or participation or other democratic values. I'll note also I've also shopped the book around a little bit to non-election law but still legal audiences, and found a lot of interest among sort of general public law scholars in thinking about alignment outside election law. So there's one chapter of the book that very preliminarily tries to think about how non-electoral institutions and rules are either aligning or misaligning. And so, Darrell Levinson and Dick Fallon here and Michael Dorff have been intrigued by some of those suggestions and have been interested in trying to work out whether alignment has appeal as sort of a general constitutional value, not specifically within election law.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up quickly, and then I want other people to chime in. As you know from our previous conversations, and as I'll talk about it at the symposium, I'm interested in both as an empirical matter and as a theoretical matter, the relationship of the alignment principle, which I like the idea of it driving our analysis of election law, with the potential attack from those people who embrace the so-called arrows and possibility theorem that that alignment's not possible under certain circumstances, given the so-called proof of the theorem that Arrow gave. And as I think you say in the book, and as we've talked about, we're fortunate that in many observed circumstances, preferences do align themselves in a way that's coherent so that we wouldn't have to worry about the notion of impossible. I mean, just to be really quick about it, the impossibility theorem is that for a given set of inputs, if the inputs are of a certain nature, you can't actually get a single coherent output in terms of what the public collectively wants by any fair social choice aggregation mechanism, because of this mathematical proof that we're not going to get into on the podcast, obviously. And as you've said, for the good news is that's not empirically observable in many instances. But I wonder, A, as a matter of theory, whether we still need to worry about it for the few occasions where it might exist, and also just whether to have a coherent conception of democracy that we then want to apply to all of our election law, whether we have to grapple into account for this, so-called impossibility theorem lurking in the background.
Yeah, great. I mean, I do think that Arrow's theorem, the impossibility critique, plus some of the related public choice critiques that people's preferences are unstable, incoherent, highly volatile. I think in principle, those are devastating objections to the alignment approach, because the approach hinges on people's preferences being coherent enough to serve as a sort of reference point relative to which we can assess representation and policy. And so if it were the case that there was endless cycling of preferences, or that people's preferences bounce around, so what you want today isn't what you want tomorrow, then I would have to concede that alignment would be a sort of futile goal for an electoral system. Like you can't align outputs with inputs that are chaotic and bouncing around and incoherent. So I do think in theory, this is a very powerful and very alarming critique. And my only response can really be practical and empirical, that, you know, as a matter of observed reality, we don't see rampant cycling of preferences. We don't see rampant volatility of preferences. We see a lot of stability and coherence, especially once you aggregate preferences from, you know, a single individual to many individuals. So I have sort of an odd stance with respect to those critiques, which is that I agree with those critiques, that they're devastating in principle. And I just count us lucky that both in the US and as far as we know in many other settings, people's preferences are meaningful enough that we can talk about alignment. You know, if Converse and Arrow and so on were right, I think we would have to abandon alignment in favor of less ambitious, less demanding democratic goals. You know, maybe free and fair elections are the best we can do if people's preferences are not meaningful. But since they are meaningful, we can aspire to something more ambitious like alignment, I think.
Say a little more about the way in which you want to think about misalignment at a kind of more global scale. I mean, you say this more articulately than I'm trying to summarize it, but in part, I think what you have said is that it's more than just looking at a series of one-off misalignments. It's that you can avoid some of the difficulties of things like even Arrow's theorem by looking more large or more holistically about a host of ways in which we aggregate not just preferences across individuals, but preferences across a number of types of issues, if you will, and then see the misalignment at a larger scale.
Yes, if I had to summarize my empirical orientation, it's that aggregation is our friend. And aggregation is key both when we're thinking about people's preferences and whether they're meaningful, and also when it comes to measuring alignment or misalignment in our society. So as you mentioned, there are innumerable individual issues in politics. There may well be substantial misalignment on any one or numerous of those issues. It's totally unrealistic for any political system to expect perfect alignment issue by issue by issue. You know, there's nothing that would generate that level of optimal alignment. So what I think is both a more reasonable expectation and maybe a more attractive goal is sort of rough aggregate alignment over many different issues, where we can forgive misalignment in one or multiple areas if they're offset by alignment in other respects. So it's more reasonable to expect the political system to produce that kind of rough overall alignment. And it's also, I think, a more attractive goal because it allows for more play in the joints. You know, it avoids making alignment the one thing we have to aim for in all circumstances. So on any given issue, there might be a very good justification for misalignment. Like maybe the people are quite uninformed on some technical issue. Maybe some other issue is new, and so the political system hasn't had enough time to adapt and produce an aligned outcome. In some other area, maybe people have malignant views, and so we're happy to have courts take the issue out of the political process, even if that produces misalignment. So I'm not bothered by those instances of issue-specific misalignment. What really bothers me and sort of motivates the book is when you have consistent distortion of outcomes. usually in some identifiable direction. So in favor of the wealthy, or in favor of the ideological extremes, or in favor of the status quo, or in favor of white voters, not minority voters. Those persistent patterns of misalignment, I think, are the real problem the book raises, as opposed to just one-off instances of misalignment.
Nick, can you give examples of how alignment theory can remedy those consistent misalignments that you were just discussing?
Yeah, a nice example from an area that I know well is that in states that had extreme Republican partisan gerrymanders in the 2010s, we saw really rampant pro-Republican, pro-conservative misalignment. So, states like Wisconsin or Michigan with very sort of balanced electorates, just adopting policies that looked like, Alabama's policies. And that was directly attributable to having a legislature that was much more conservative, much more Republican than the people of the state wanted, courtesy of aggressive gerrymandering. And so both in Michigan's the best example because an independent commission drew fair maps for Michigan, and Democrats won narrow majorities under those fair maps. And we saw basically an immediate end to that pattern of extreme pro-Republican misalignment in Michigan. Maybe even now there's a bit of a overreaction the other way. But it tells me that certain electoral practices like gerrymandering can have enormous misaligning effects. And if you take away the gerrymandering, you can see rapid improvement in the situation in a place like Michigan. So that's I guess kind of like a real world example of where there was a lot of misalignment with an electoral route, and it evaporated fairly quickly once the electoral practices were reformed in Michigan.
Nick, can you say a little bit about how you think about the relationship between alignment and populism and sort of the non-majoritarian parts of our system? You alluded a little bit to the courts, but how do you think about those things?
Yeah, so from one perspective, I see alignment as sort of true, non-invidious, non-pernicious populism. With populism, I often worry that the claims to be speaking in favor of the people or for the people are just manufactured. They're just false. Whereas with alignment, we actually look at what does the electorate want, and we assess outputs relative to what voters really want, not what certain demagogic leaders say that voters want. So I'm very suspicious of populism, in part because I think it's not truly aspiring to genuine alignment, but it's actually endorsing all sorts of distortions in the name of views that people don't actually hold. Putting that aside, if I were a sort of alignment maximalist, then I would have some qualms about things like agencies doing regulation without direct political supervision, or voter or the people wanting to discriminate against certain targeted minorities. But I'm not a maximalist, and I try to make this point in the book that I think alignment is an attractive goal for our political system, but it's not the only one. And there's certainly some circumstances where I would happily sacrifice alignment in order to protect minority rights or to protect free speech. Law and governance are complex, and I think it's wrong to expect any single value to always be the sole objective that you're aiming for. So, my goal in the book is to add alignment to the conversation, to make the case that quite often alignment is very compelling, But I definitely want to concede that there are circumstances involving, tyranny of the majority or uninformed voters where we don't want alignment with, uninformed or invidious views. And so I'm happy to endorse judicial review or bureaucratization as an alternative to alignment when the circumstances dictate that.
If I can follow up on Terry's question for a second. So I've written recently, both on my Substack and in a law review paper, that I think that Nikki Haley would have been the Condorcet winner in the 24 presidential election if we had had a Condorcet system, for the presidential election. And if that's accurate, then the result of Trump's victory was a misalignment with the electoral preferences that voters had last year. I'd be curious as to whether you agree or disagree with that. And then if you agree with it, I mean, it seems like the public conversation after November was that because Trump won the national popular vote, there was not a misalignment between the electoral college system and the national popular vote that so many people want. That's accurate, but my view, that's a misunderstanding of what true alignment with respect to a national popular vote would be. And I'm just curious as to whether or not we can use the alignment theory to educate the public and educate a conversation about, exactly what would make sense for American politics given people's preferences. So as you're observing the start of the new second Trump administration, are you seeing that in alignment with what voters wanted in November or a product of misalignment?
Yeah, great. So I agree with you, Ned, that when we think about alignment with respect to candidates, there's no need to be limited to the particular set of candidates that happen to be on the general election ballot. We can and we should think about alignment or misalignment between who wins and voters' preferences with respect to a fuller set of candidates. And I also am with you that either Condorcet voting or other similar modes of voting are good ways for ascertaining people's preferences among large sets of candidates. So I don't know myself what polling would show about who the Condorcet winner would be in a pool that included, Haley, Biden or Harris, Trump, and others. It's quite plausible, as you say, that somebody like Nikki Haley would be the Condorcet winner. And Nikki Haley, I think, would have quite different policy positions, quite different, orientations to American governance than Trump does. And so the fact that Trump won the general election with a more limited ballot doesn't establish that we have great alignment right now. There might be quite substantial misalignment relative to people's preferences when given a fuller set of choices. Even if we move beyond the sort of the Condorcet perspective and just look at the general election, at most, what the general election establishes is that we didn't have a wrong winner outcome like 2016 or 2000. We don't have the candidate that a majority of voters opposed in the general election taking office. But as I note in the book, partisan alignment, the absence of a wrong winner outcome in an election hardly means that you're guaranteed good representational alignment or good policy alignment. And so it's possible, it's very likely that Trump and his administration are going to do many things that the American public opposes, and that will give rise to really significant misalignment. And so, the sheer fact of winning an election by no means guarantees alignment, and I think we're about to see that reality over the next few years.
Nick, could you discuss the difference between representational alignment and policy alignment?
Yeah, this refers to the distinction between politicians taking stances on issues and politicians actually adopting policies in different areas. So I think policy alignment, in my view, is sort of the fundamentally important kind of alignment. That's the most important kind. Policies are what affect people's lives. Policies are what people have preferences about, and so that's what I'm ultimately most concerned about. But like what legislators do in legislatures is also quite important. And we often think about good representation for voters in a given district or in a given jurisdiction. And when we think about representation, we generally have in mind what a legislator is doing in his or her job. We don't usually have in mind the ultimate outputs of the political process. And so I think that representational alignment matters as well. We ought to aspire to legislators who individually and collectively are aligned with the preferences of their constituents. And clearly, good representational alignment is going to be one of the principal drivers of good policy alignment. It can be blocked by other things. Like maybe you have a filibuster, maybe you have an executive branch who vetoes the laws or the bills passed by the legislature. But certainly, in general, more representational alignment is correlated with more policy alignment too. And so I care about both of those, but I put more weight on the scale in favor of ultimate policy alignment.
We'll want to wrap this episode up in just a few more minutes. So let me ask one last question myself and see if others have a last question. So the book, Nick, is obviously a culmination of a number of different projects you've had and building on things you've been doing for a decade or more. And now that it's done, do you have a next project, something that builds on this now?
I don't have another project of the same scale and ambition currently. When I was working on the book, I had a whole bunch of other paper ideas that were piling up. And so one nice thing with finishing the book is that I've finally been able to turn to some of these ideas. And so I've been writing a lot since finishing the book last year, but not on another project like this one. I've been writing about a new system of proportional representation, looking empirically at ranked choice voting elections. I had a little campaign finance paper. I had a longer article on new trends in the electorate and what those new trends mean for different areas of election law. I have a couple projects now involving redistricting algorithms, but I would say that I'm kind of bouncing around right now, as opposed to like systematically working on another project like this one. I'm sure that I'll eventually think of another idea that warrants a book, but I don't currently have one, and I'm not sure what that idea is going to be. So for the moment, I'm enjoying doing several different articles as opposed to diving right into another book.
Well, and I think we're delighted to see you bouncing around in a number of different things. Thanks. What else? Any other last questions anyone has?
Well, I think we should save some questions for the symposium itself and hope that our podcast audience tunes in for the main event, as it were.
And just as a reminder to our audience, the symposium can be viewed via Zoom, and there will be a link placed in the messages section that you can click on so that you can watch the either live or the recorded version of the symposium that will be live on Friday.
That's right. So for the live symposium, it's Friday, February 21st. Well, we'll leave it there then for today. Nick, thank you again for being with us. And thanks to Ned and Tony and Terry as well for joining me on this episode of Law and Democracy. and we'll look forward to our next episode. Bye-bye.